from that background. It's an imitation of the life of Christ.
Itself gets dissolved because then who is the subject?
Count as thanatopoiesis for the simple reason there is a denial of death first of all.
The India's Most Trusted Brand of the Year Awards 2024 with the first award category, which is Best UGC NET JRF English Coaching in Delhi by Vineet Pandey. It goes to Professor Vineet Pandey.
दिल्ली में सीएमपी द्वारा दूसरा अंतर्राष्ट्रीय सम्मेलन डॉक्टर दीक्षा त्रिपाठी ने थैनेटोपॉलिटिक्स पर चर्चा की।
Now, next on board is our next keynote speaker is none other than Professor Dr. Stefan Lorenz Sorgner, joining us virtually from John Cabot University, Rome, a leading global voice in post-human philosophy. Professor Sorgner is a director of the Beyond Humanism Network and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Posthuman Studies. His work continues to push the boundaries of how we imagine humanity, technology, and the future. Sir, it is a privilege to have you with us today. We invite you for your keynote address.
Today, Professor Sorgner will be speaking on death, eternal recurrence, and meaning of life. In this profound theme, he invites us to consider how mortality, repetition, and philosophy can guide us in reimagining the future of human existence in the post-human condition. Please join me from across continents in extending a heartfelt and resounding round of applause for Dr. Professor Stefan Lorenz Sorgner.
Many thanks for this kind introduction. Yeah, I'm extremely happy to see how the post-human discourse has now moved to so many different fields, and they really become an intense global and local debate concerning all the fundamental issues. And that's why I'm particularly happy that today sort of the topic of Thanatopolitics is being addressed. Because it's really sort of the foundation when it comes to the question of the good life. Really, what is ultimately the issue is the question of the meaning of life. And it reminds me when I read Carl Gustav Jung, one of the founders of depth psychology. He had, like most of his patients, they were sort of in the Middle Ages, middle-aged people. They were successful, they had a family, you know, they had a good reputation, very good jobs, you know, family, kids, and everything you could normally identify with living a good life, a fulfilled life. But they were actually permanently struggling with the issue of a meaning. What is it all there for? Is there something which basically has a bearing beyond our own existence? Because all of them realized basically the traditional narrative, which used to provide people with the meaning of life, was no longer valid, was no longer plausible, did no longer provide them with a justification for their own existence. And the traditional narrative is of course connected to the Judeo-Christian tradition, which used to be the dominant religious understanding in the Western world. And sort of it started off, maybe the initial traces of this Judeo-Christian tradition can also be traced to Platonic thinking. And then it's become more and more dominant, and it was rooted in a binary way of thinking. It all understood sort of the world is basically, there's a this worldly, there's a material element of the world, but there's also something immaterial. There's something which moves beyond, which is accessible to the senses. And this used to be the fundamental humanist binary understanding, which was dominant from Plato's time up until, you know, basically Darwin thinking, Nietzsche thinking, and those have been Spinoza's way of thinking, and those have been the intellectuals and cultural critics who basically initialized this move towards a post-human paradigm shift, move away from a binary understanding, binary ontological understanding, which basically conceptualized the world as a material on the one hand and something immaterial on the other hand. And usually what provided meaning to human people's lives was that immaterial, was that something beyond, was that something, the hope of living in an immaterial realm after we will have died in this world. So with the post-human paradigm shift, this question had to be addressed anew. And this was also the reason why most of the clients, most of the patients which came to Carl Gustav Jung, they were struggling to find a meaning because they realized they no longer bought in the story. They no longer believed in the narrative that there is a personal afterlife, that something will be there, which, you know, an afterlife in which they live there, meet their beloved ones, in which they themselves can continue to exist. And so the question was, what is it all there for? You know, we live here these couple of years on Earth. It's full of suffering. It's full of struggles. It's full of pain. And then, you know, eventually, if we're lucky enough, we make it to 80. Many people die early already. And most of the time we spend suffering and wanting and desiring and unfulfilled hopes, and we don't realize, and there's grief, already a lot of grief in this life we need to deal with. And eventually, even if we have sort of offspring, the offspring will die, and the offspring might have offspring, and they will die. And if they continue to exist, well, on Earth, the Earth might have still another 4 billion years. Eventually it will explode, it will enter into the sun. You know, the world, though, is a very dynamic entity, so there's nothing which stays, there's nothing which lasts. Even if you have Dante and you've written the Divine Comedy, even if you've created the Taj Mahal, you know, whatever has happened, everything, the greatest works of art, the greatest philosophies, they'll all come to an end, they'll all die. And sort of the question of the meaning of life is sort of, you know, the fundamental issue in particular. Now, as we no longer have that hope, as this hope in a personalized afterlife is no longer something which is at least the most plausible variant. It's not being excluded, but at least it's no longer the most plausible narrative. And that's a consequence of the post-human paradigm shift. And post-human paradigm shift is fundamentally connected to a binary understanding, binary ontological understanding, turning into a non-dualistic ontological understanding. And what that non-dualistic ontological understanding means, that's an open question, and there are various different takes on basically how we try to make sense of the world, how we try to conceptualize the world. And you know, there's a critical posthumanism who are focusing on developing a non-binary, a non-dualistic way of grasping and making sense of the world. There's a transhumanist way of dealing with it. There's a meta-humanistic way of dealing with. There's so many different versions of posthumanism and transhumanism, and that's important actually. That they're extremely different varieties. One shouldn't take it for granted. You know, just in a very simple-minded, solely identified transhumanism was mind uploading, or you know. And critical posthumanism, the same applies to critical posthumanism. They're radical posthumanists who basically say, no, the world would be the best place if you know, the cancer of the earth and the world would be the best place if humans were not to exist any longer, because we humans basically are responsible for carbon dioxide emissions, and therefore we are the source of all the other species dying, of basically life being destroyed, mass extinction of species. And that's a radical posthumanist on which I don't subscribe to, but you know, just to highlight the enormous diversity of different approaches which goes along with the posthuman paradigm shift. My own story basically took me back. I've always been concerned with the question of that. This is what basically took me to philosophy initially. I used to be dealing with physics and mathematics when I was very young onwards. On the other hand, I had a sort of religious background, and I couldn't make sense of it, couldn't bring both of these elements together. And so at the age of 13, I turned towards philosophy. I basically read my first book of philosophy, Heraclitus on Nature, and from Heraclitus, it basically took me further to Nietzsche. And by the age of 20, I'd read all of Nietzsche's writings. And basically sort of Heraclitus and Nietzsche still have strongly shaped sort of my way of trying to make sense of the world. And this also applies to the question, and both of them, I think there's a strong connection from, Heraclitus, Spinoza, Nietzsche, and all of them can be seen as ancestors of a post-human, of a non-dualistic way of trying to make sense of the world. And today also I want to highlight basically one of the insights which can be traced in the thought of Heraclitus, Spinoza, as well as Nietzsche. None of them have really developed it in full in trying to. None of them managed to have a full reconceptualization of what they had in mind. But the thought is basically a non-dualistic way of trying to dealing with the tricky question of a meaning in life. And so on the one hand, we've moved away from that understanding that there's the possibility of a personalized afterworld has become more and more implausible after the post-human paradigm shift. So we live in a world of permanent becoming. There's nothing which remains stable. Everything's changing in all respects at all times, and there is nothing which we can hold on to. Even ourselves, I regularly stress when we encounter the arts, in the same way as we cannot step into the same river twice, we cannot encounter the same artworks twice, because all elements of us are changing as well as all of the rest of the world. But the question with the meaning, is there something which is relevant for us, which sort of move beyond our limited existence, very limited existence on Earth? And the thought which captured me most, it can be traced to Heraclitus, Spinoza, and Nietzsche, because sort of what they were trying to do is we cannot grasp the meaning of the sense infinity. Infinity, we would need an infinite amount of time just to make sense of what infinity stands for. And so, in particular, Nietzsche was concerned with trying to get rid of the notion of infinity, because philosophically it just, it evaporates. Once we take it seriously and try to make sense what it stands for, we cannot do so. And that actually led Nietzsche to the thought of the eternal recurrence, which he clearly held as a cosmological theory. It also has a lot of ethical and political implications. But he affirmed it, and he regarded it as clearly as a scientifically, he regarded it as a plausible theory for sort of the scientific age, for the age of science, technology, which appeals to scientifically minded thinkers. And he even considered moving to Paris to study physics to prove the eternal recurrence is actually is scientifically itself. In his notebooks, which he didn't publish himself, he put forward several reflections and arguments by means of which he tried to present the plausibility of the eternal recurrence of everything. But none of his lines of reasoning was actually conclusive. He tried then, he put forward actually arguments and always trying to get rid of infinity as part of the premises, because we cannot make sense of infinity. It needs to be stressed that it's not the case that, I don't think it is the case that no conclusive argument can be presented, no conclusive line of reasoning can be presented forward to render plausible the eternal recurrence as a theory. But at least Nietzsche didn't manage to realize it. The central thought which needs to apply is an attempt to eliminate infinities when thinking about ontologies, as no infinity can be meaningfully conceptualized, no infinity can be completed, and by doing so, the following judgments actually arise by trying to get rid of the notion of infinity. And on the one hand, so if we cannot make sense of an infinite energy, the total amount of energy has to be finite. And that's actually an insight which does correspond to contemporary to things to premises which are being shared by contemporary physicists too. Energy, again, how can energy turn up? Energy can only turn up in finite amount of states, in finite amount of properties. And that is also something which you can find in modern physics. Modern physical theory holds that energy can only appear in quantities which are the integral multiple of the Planck constant, which again supports the position that only can turn up in finite amount of states, which means energy can only appear in a quantity n times the Planck constant, whereby n is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we again get rid of another element of infinity. Then furthermore, time and space must not be independent of energy, but do not exist. They do not exist as separate infinite entities, because this is sort of something Euclidean space or something. This used to be conceptualized as infinite, as something independent of energy, but sort of and it would have to include that it's infinite. But so finite energy means that it's also it is always part of the energy which exists. One of the thoughts which actually supports that kind of, there's no perfect vacuum. There's always something there, which is one of the insight in physics, which does support that premise too. The law governing the energy must be a determined one. There's not an infinite law, but there's a determined law. And scientists attempt to realize the GUT, the great unified theory, which tries to find a theory by means of which the four fundamental forces can be unified: the strong force, the weak force, the electromagnetic, as well as the gravitational force. Then, another premise is the reversibility of all states must be given. And the Einstein's theory of relativity seems to allow this. So it's not possible that once you've had a state, it will be impossible that it can recur. That's a further premise. And if all of these premises are given, and all of them are actually supported by contemporary science, then it's a necessary inference. That's a necessary conclusion that at a certain moment, all possible combinations of energy have occurred. If one state recurs, in the same law of the universe still applies, then it's a logical necessity that the reversibility, that all the other states continue to develop. It's like everything recurs in an identical manner. So the reversibility of all states is then not excluded, and the law governing the energy is a determined one. Then it's necessary that the entire cycle of the eternal recurrence has to begin anew, and all events which have occurred before need to occur again. However, at this point, we run into a linguistic challenge. As philosophically speaking, it's false to claim that events have occurred before. If events occurred before, then we do not take identity in the strongest Leibnizian sense seriously. If recurrence of the same implies an identity in the strongest Leibnizian sense, we do not end up having the ends, the n+1 circle, the n+2 circle, but we always have the same circle. If we talk about recurrence, and if we take the notion of identity seriously, then it's not like us spinning around the wheel and there's another circle and in the future, but it always has to be the same circle in which we're moving. If we talk about recurrence, we still have a linear concept of time in mind, because then the next circle would be n+1, n+2, n+3. If the aforementioned premises are plausible, then we would end up with a circular concept of time, from A to Z to A to Z to A to Z, and it is not different. It is because it's identical in strongest Leibnizian sense of identity. So which implications would this concept of time have for the question of the meaning of life? If we become aware of the eternal recurrence, we know that whatever we do will recur infinitely often, will recur. Everything will occur, which occurs is necessary, but as we do not know what will happen, it seems to us if it was possible for us to freely decide what we wish to do. That's basically the tension in which we're caught. Because on the one hand, like getting rid of infinities in our way of thinking leads us to the thought of eternal recurrence. But of course, we don't know what will happen. And so personally, we do feel free. So that's a tension in which we live. But, you know, we seem to be forced to making decisions and choices. But, you know, thinking, you know, if there's non-dualistic thinking with getting rid of infinities applies, we know that everything is actually fate, everything is necessary. And I don't talk about determination because determination presumes a determinator. And that, again, implies something which is highly implausible. So free will in that case is merely the uncertainty of knowing what will happen next. Free will is merely our feeling of, you know, us feeling free as a consequence of that. Not making a decision is not acting or not acting is not an option. Not acting or acting a decision you're making. Hence, we still try to reach our goals as we will have always done, while thinking that whatever occurs is necessary and it has to occur. Furthermore, it's possible that the eternal recurrence can change your preferences. Most human beings identify long and healthy life with a higher quality of life. However, if you're living a long and healthy life without ever realizing what is important to you, might not be a better life at all, because this is basically the focus, what you need to realize if the eternal recurrence applies. You know, there will be one moment which will, you know, recur again and again. And if you have lived one moment by means of which is so fulfilling, which is so brilliant, which is so wonderful, then basically all the suffering which occurs beforehand and what would necessarily occurs later on is justified by just having lived that moment. And that is sort of the alternative shift which we need to focus on. If eternal recurrence is something where you find plausible on the basis of that kind of reasoning. So instead of focusing on expanding the health span, and maybe it might still be on expanding the health span, but Nietzsche regarded as central to experience one situation by means of which one can justify the entire life, and whatever had happened before and then what would happen afterwards, as the awareness of the eternal recurrence leads to an altered state of awareness. You know that you've experienced that special moment, which is worth all the suffering you have to endure, and once you have experienced it. As you know that this one special moment will recur again and again and again, and you will meet your friends and families in the same way as you lived before. And that is what the eternal recurrence implies. But sort of the justification for bearing all the suffering and pain we all need to get through is that special moment, because it will happen again. You will be, you know, there's a way to justify, you know, just because that moment must be so special that that basically enables you to bear all the other elements you need to go through before and after. Amor fati, love your fate. Hence, experience such a moment provides you with a meaning in life. A meaning in life which no need for an eternal, you know, for an immaterial afterlife. And this is thought by itself might enable a person to bear all the suffering each one of us has to go through. One moment can justify your entire life and provide you with meaning. So Nietzsche stressed that an expanded health span is what the last man, the majority of human beings, strive for. However, the ones who've grasped the challenging insight of the eternal recurrence will seek for the moments by means of which they can give meaning to their entire lives. Spinoza held a comparable concept with his amor intellectualis Dei. On the one hand, everything's necessary. On the other hand, of course, you know, we need to make a decision. Goethe's Faust, he also sought a comparable goal when he made the contract with the devil. That's a fundamental element of Goethe's Faust. And he sort of says, if ever I to the moment shall say, beautiful moment, do not pass away, then you may forge your chains to bind me, then I will put my life behind me, then let them hear my death knell toll. Then from your labors you'll be free, the clock may stop, the clock hands fall, and time to an end for me. So it is whether Mephistopheles fulfills the demands, the devil fulfills the demands in the second part is a tricky issue. It depends on the reading of Faust 2. However, it needs to be noted that the thought of returns had already been held, not just by Nietzsche, but also already by Heraclitus, the Pythagorean Eudemus of Rhodes, and some Stoic thinkers as well. Here you see, so what Heraclitus wrote was, there's a great year whose winter is a great flood, cataclysmos, and whose summer is an ekpyrosis, that is the world conflagration, for it is thought that in these alternating periods the world is now going up in flames, now turning to water. Heraclitus and Linus believed the cycle to consist of 10,800 years. Eudemus of Rhodes explicitly states the following: everything will eventually return to the self-same numerical order, and I shall converse with you and stuff in hand, and you will sit as you are sitting now, and so it will be in everything else, and it's reasonable to assume that time too will be the same. So various Stoics get associated with the idea. Zeno, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus hold that matter undergoes transmutation, as for the example, fire turns into seed, from which once again it is restored the same world order that was before. Chrysippus in particular is mentioned in this context. Chrysippus in the first book of Nature says, the transmutation of fire is as follows. It turns first into air, then into water, and when the water at the bottom at which earth settles, air rises. As the air becomes rarefied, the aether is spread around in a circle, and the stars and the sun are kindled from the sea. It is important to realize the circular idea of time has been shared by quite a few significant thinkers in the history of philosophy, but it's mostly absent in contemporary discourses, which strongly hold on to a more intuitively plausible linear account of time. However, it might be the case that we merely affirm a linear conception of time to ways of thinking being strongly influenced by the Christian cultural past, which demands this way of thinking, as otherwise we could not meaningfully wait for the return of Jesus Christ, for the parousia of Jesus Christ. What we can infer from these reflections is that the concept of the meaning of life has significant implications for our concept of the good life. If there's no meaning, we might merely be like Camus' Sisyphus, permanently dealing with our painful efforts and duties and tasks, which we can either accept, which Camus suggested, or affirm, try to affirm like Nietzsche, or reject like Schopenhauer. If our meaning lies in a blissful afterlife, we need to do our best to realize it, which usually means to fulfill God's demands and hope for God's grace. The eternal recurrence is the most plausible non-otherworldly account of the meaning of life, a proper non-dualistic, a proper post-human account of the meaning of life, which goes along, which is a principle in tune with transhumanism, critical post-humanism. And if this applies, then Nietzsche's suggestion of a good life is at least a plausible option, to aim for a moment which is so glorious that it can justify all the great amounts of suffering we have to go through in this life. And this is sort of an understanding which, I've thought about that for so long, initially dealt with it at the age of 13. I started dealing explicitly with posthumanism and transhumanism more than 25 years ago, since 1999. Basically dealing with Sloterdijk, and then furthermore moved into the enormous field of posthuman studies. Since 2009, I established an annual Beyond Humanism conference series, book series, and so on. Since it's 2017, I established the Journal of Posthuman Studies, and I invite all of you to submit. That's the first journal explicitly dedicated to the posthuman. It comes out as a double-blind, peer-reviewed journal with Penn State University Press, in print as well as online. So invite all of you to submit your groundbreaking reflections on these issues to the journal. And sort of the eternal recurrence was basically the understanding which I thought was the most plausible understanding, and how to basically think in a non-binary manner about issues of life and death, and which has strong political, ethical implication. Then suddenly what becomes relevant is to focus on one moment, basically by means of which we can justify our entire existences. Many thanks for all your attention, and I'm looking forward to further exchange.
Thank you so much, sir, for your valuable insights. Your words have not only deepened our understanding, but also enriched the spirit of inquiry that this conference seeks to foster. Finding meaning in life has been a constant quest of our lives. Even if we lived a great life, it culminates into an end called death. From philosophies of Spinoza and Nietzsche to our own insights, we got a glimpse of posthuman life, that infinity is just a myth. You lit our brains with multitudes of wisdom. Thanking you so much, sir, for your enlightening wisdom.